Chapter 4. The Little Attic Room. Miss Polly Harrington did not rise to meet her niece. She looked up from her book, it is true, as Nancy and the little girl appeared in the sitting-room doorway, and she held out a hand with duty written large on every coldly extended finger. "How do you do, Pollyanna? She had no chance to say more. Pollyanna had fairly flown across the room and flung herself into her aunt's scandalized, unyielding lap. "Oh, Aunt Polly, I don't know how to be glad enough that you let me come to live with you," she was sobbing. "You don't know how perfectly lovely it is to have you and Nancy and all this after you've just had the Ladies' Aid." "Very likely, though I've not had the pleasure of the Ladies' Aid acquaintance," rejoined Miss Polly stiffly, trying to unclasp the small clinging fingers and turning frowning eyes on Nancy in the doorway. "Nancy, that will do. You may go. Pollyanna, be good enough, please, to stand erect in a proper manner. I don't know yet what you look like." Pollyanna drew back at once, laughing a little hysterically. "No, I suppose you don't. But you see, I'm not very much to look at, anyway, on account of the freckles. Oh, and I ought to explain about the red gingham and the black velvet basque and the white spots on the elbows. I told Nancy how Father said—" "Yes, well, never mind now what your father said," interrupted Miss Polly crisply. "You had a trunk, I presume?" "Oh, yes, indeed, Aunt Polly. I've got a beautiful trunk that the Ladies' Aid gave me. I haven't got so very much in it, of my own, I mean. The barrels haven't had many clothes for little girls in them lately, but there are all Father's books, and Mrs. White said she thought I ought to have those. You see, Father—" "Pollyanna," interrupted her aunt again sharply, "there is one thing that might just as well be understood right away at once, and that is, I do not care to have you keep talking of your father to me." The little girl drew in her breath tremulously. "Why, Aunt Polly, you mean—" She hesitated, and her aunt filled the pause. "We will go upstairs to your room. Your trunk is already there, I presume. I told Timothy to take it up, if you had one. You may follow me, Pollyanna." Without speaking, Pollyanna turned and followed her aunt from the room. Her eyes were brimming with tears, but her chin was bravely high. "After all, I reckon I'm glad she doesn't want me to talk about Father," Pollyanna was thinking. "It'll be easier, maybe, if I don't talk about him. Probably, anyhow, that is why she told me not to talk about him." And Pollyanna, convinced anew of her aunt's kindness, blinked off the tears and looked eagerly about her. She was on the stairway now. Just ahead, her aunt's black silk skirt rustled luxuriously. Behind her an open door allowed a glimpse of soft-tinted rugs and satin-covered chairs. Beneath her feet a marvelous carpet was like green moss to the tread. On every side the gilt of picture frames or the glint of sunlight through the filmy mesh of lace curtains flashed in her eyes. "Oh, Aunt Polly, breathed the little girl rapturously. "What a perfectly lovely, lovely house! How awfully glad you must be you're so rich." "Pollyanna!" ejaculated her aunt, turning sharply about as she reached the head of the stairs. "I'm surprised at you, making a speech like that to me." "Why, Aunt Polly, aren't you?" queried Pollyanna in frank wonder. "Certainly not, Pollyanna. I hope I could not so far forget myself as to be sinfully proud of any gift the Lord has seen fit to bestow upon me," declared the lady. "Certainly not of riches." Miss Polly turned and walked down the hall toward the attic stairway door. She was glad now that she had put the child in the attic room. Her idea at first had been to get her niece as far away as possible from herself, and at the same time place her where her childish heedlessness would not destroy valuable furnishings. Now, with this evident strain of vanity showing thus early, It was all the more fortunate that the room planned for her was plain and sensible, thought Miss Polly. Eagerly Pollyanna's little feet pattered behind her aunt. Still more eagerly her big blue eyes tried to look in all directions at once, that no thing of beauty or interest in this wonderful house might be passed unseen. Most eagerly of all, her mind turned to the wondrously exciting problem about to be solved, behind which of all these fascinating doors was waiting now her room. The dear, beautiful room full of curtains, rugs, and pictures that was to be her very own. Then, abruptly, her aunt opened a door and ascended another stairway. There was little to be seen here. A bare wall rose on either side. At the top of the stairs, wide reaches of shadowy space led to far corners, where the roof came almost down to the floor, and where were stacked innumerable trunks and boxes. It was hot and stifling, too. Unconsciously, Pollyanna lifted her head higher. It seemed so hard to breathe. Then she saw that her aunt had thrown open a door at the right. "There, Pollyanna, here is your room, and your trunk is here, I see. Have you your key?" Pollyanna nodded dumbly. Her eyes were a little wide and frightened. Her aunt frowned. "When I ask a question, Pollyanna, I prefer that you should answer aloud, not merely with your head." "Yes, Aunt Polly." "Thank you. That is better. I believe you have everything you need here," she added, glancing at the well-filled towel rack and water pitcher. "I will send Nancy up to help you unpack. Supper is at 6 o'clock," she finished, as she left the room and swept downstairs. For a moment after she had gone, Pollyanna stood quite still, looking after her. Then she turned her wide eyes to the bare wall, the bare floor, the bare windows. She turned them last to the little trunk that had stood not so long before in her own little room in the far-away western home. The next moment she stumbled blindly toward it and fell on her knees at its side, covering her face with her hands. Nancy found her there when she came up a few minutes later. "There, there, you poor lamb," she crooned, dropping to the floor, drawing the little girl into her arms. "I was just a-fearin' I'd find you like this, like this." Pollyanna shook her head. "But I'm bad and wicked, Nancy. Awful wicked," she sobbed. "I just can't make myself understand that God and the angels needed my father more than I did." "No more they did, neither," declared Nancy stoutly. "Oh, Nancy!" The burning horror in Pollyanna's eyes dried the tears. Nancy gave a shamefaced smile and rubbed her own eyes vigorously. "There, there, child, I didn't mean it, of course," she cried briskly. "Come, let's have your key, and we'll get inside this trunk and take out your dresses in no time, no time." Somewhat tearfully, Pollyanna produced the key. "There aren't very many there, anyway," she faltered. "Then they're all the sooner unpacked," declared Nancy. Pollyanna gave a sudden, radiant smile. "That's so! I can be glad of that, can't I?" she cried. Nancy stared. "Why, of course," she answered a little uncertainly. Nancy's capable hands made short work of unpacking the books, the patched undergarments, and the few pitifully unattractive dresses. Pollyanna, smiling bravely now, flew about, hanging the dresses in the closet, stacking the books on the table, and putting away the undergarments in the bureau drawers. "I'm sure it's going to be a very nice room, don't you think so?" she stammered after a while. There was no answer. Nancy was very busy, apparently, with her head in the trunk. Pollyanna, standing at the bureau, gazed a little wistfully at the bare wall above. "And I can be glad there isn't any looking-glass here, too, 'cause where there isn't any glass I can't see my freckles." Nancy made a sudden queer little sound with her mouth, but when Pollyanna turned, her head was in the trunk again. At one of the windows a few minutes later, Pollyanna gave a glad cry and clapped her hands joyously. "Oh, Nancy, I hadn't seen this before," she breathed. Look, way off there, with those trees and the houses and that lovely church spire, and the river shining just like silver. Why, Nancy, there doesn't anybody need any pictures with that to look at. Oh, I'm so glad now she let me have this room." To Pollyanna's surprise and dismay, Nancy burst into tears. Pollyanna hurriedly crossed to her side. "Why, Nancy, Nancy, what is it?" she cried, then fearfully, "This wasn't your room, was it?" "My room," stormed Nancy hotly, choking back the tears. "If you ain't a little angel straight from heaven, and if some folks don't eat dirt before, oh, land, there's her bell." After which amazing speech, Nancy sprang to her feet, dashed out of the room, and went clattering down the stairs. Left alone, Pollyanna went back to her picture, as she mentally designated the beautiful view from the window. After a time she touched the sash tentatively. It seemed as if no longer could she endure the stifling heat. To her joy, the sash moved under her fingers. The next moment the window was wide open, and Pollyanna was leaning far out, drinking in the fresh, sweet air. She ran then to the other window. That, too, soon flew up under her eager hands. A big fly swept past her nose and buzzed noisily about the room. Then another came, and another, but Pollyanna paid no heed. Pollyanna had made a wonderful discovery. Against this window a huge tree flung great branches. To Pollyanna they looked like arms outstretched, inviting her. Suddenly she laughed aloud. "I believe I can do it," she chuckled. The next moment she had climbed nimbly to the window ledge. From there it was an easy matter to step to the nearest tree branch. Then, clinging like a monkey, she swung herself from limb to limb until the lowest branch was reached. The drop to the ground was, even for Pollyanna, who was used to climbing trees, a little fearsome. She took it, however, with bated breath, swinging from her strong little arms and landing on all fours in the soft grass. Then she picked herself up and looked eagerly about her. She was at the back of the house. Before her lay a garden in which a bent old man was working. Beyond the garden a little path through an open field led up a steep hill, at the top of which a lone pine tree stood on guard beside the huge rock. To Pollyanna, at the moment, there seemed to be just one place in the world worth being in, the top of that big rock. With a run and a skillful turn, Pollyanna skipped by the bent old man, threaded her way between the orderly rows of green-growing things, and, a little out of breath, reached the path that ran through the open field. Then, determinedly, she began to climb. Already, however, she was thinking what a long, long way off that rock must be. When back at the window it had looked so near. 15 minutes later, the great clock in the hallway of the Harrington homestead struck 6. At precisely the last stroke, Nancy sounded the bell for supper. 1, 2, 3 minutes passed. Miss Polly frowned and tapped the floor with her slipper. A little jerkily she rose to her feet, went into the hall, and looked upstairs, plainly impatient. For a minute she listened intently. Then she turned and swept into the dining room. "Nancy," she said with decision, as soon as the little serving-maid appeared, "my niece is late. No, you need not call her," she added severely, as Nancy made a move toward the hall door. "I told her what time supper was, and now she will have to suffer the consequences. She may as well begin at once to learn to be punctual. When she comes down, she may have bread and milk in the kitchen." "Yes, ma'am." It was well, perhaps, that Miss Polly did not happen to be looking at Nancy's face just then. At the earliest possible moment after supper, Nancy crept up the back stairs and thence to the attic room. Bread and milk, indeed! And when the poor lamb had only just cried herself to sleep, she was muttering fiercely as she softly pushed open the door. The next moment she gave a frightened cry. "Where are you? Where have you gone? Where have you gone?" she panted, looking in the closet, under the bed, and even in the trunk and down the water pitcher. Then she flew downstairs and out to old Tom in the garden. "Mr. Tom, Mr. Tom, that blessed child's gone," she wailed. "She's vanished right up into heaven, whence she come from, poor lamb, and me told to give her bread and milk in the kitchen. Her what's eating angel food this minute, I'll warrant, I'll warrant." The old man straightened up. "Gone? Heaven?" he repeated stupidly, unconsciously sweeping the brilliant sunset sky with his gaze. He stopped, stared a moment intently, then turned with a slow grin. "Well, Nancy, it do look like as if she tried to get as nigh heaven as she could, and that's a fact," he agreed, pointing with a crooked finger to where, sharply outlined against the reddening sky, a slender wind-blown figure was poised on top of the huge rock. "Well, she ain't going to heaven that way tonight, not if I has my say," declared Nancy doggedly. "If the mistress asks, tell her I ain't forgetting the dishes, but I gone on a stroll," she flung back over her shoulder as she sped toward the path that led through the open field. Chapter 5. The Game. "For land's sake, Miss Pollyanna, what a scare you did give me!" panted Nancy, hurrying up to the big rock, down which Pollyanna had just regretfully slid. "Scare? Oh, I'm so sorry, but you mustn't really ever get scared about me, Nancy. Father and the Ladies' Aid used to do it too, till they found out I always came back all right." "But I didn't even know you'd went out," cried Nancy, tucking the little girl's hand under her arm and hurrying her down the hill. "I didn't see you go, and nobody didn't. I guess you flew right up through the roof, I do." Pollyanna skipped gleefully. "I did, most. Only I flew down instead of up. I came down the tree." Nancy stopped short. "You did what?" "Came down the tree outside my window." "My stars and stockings!" gasped Nancy, hurrying on again. "I'd like to know what your aunt would say to that." "Would you? Well, I'll tell her, then, so you can find out," promised the little girl cheerfully. "Mercy!" gasped Nancy. "No, no!" "Why, you don't mean she'd care?" cried Pollyanna, plainly disturbed. "No, yes. Well, never mind. I ain't so very particular about knowing what she'd say, truly," stammered Nancy, determined to keep one scolding from Pollyanna, if nothing more. "But, say, we better hurry. I got to get them dishes done, you know." "I'll help," promised Pollyanna promptly. "Oh, Miss Pollyanna," demurred Nancy. For a moment there was silence. The sky was darkening fast. Pollyanna took a firmer hold on her friend's arm. "I reckon I'm glad, after all, that you did get scared, a little, 'cause then you came after me." She shivered. "Poor little lamb, and you must be hungry, too. I'm afraid you'll have to have bread and milk in the kitchen with me. Your aunt didn't like it, because you didn't come down to supper, you know." "But I couldn't. I was up here." "Yes, but she didn't know that, you see," observed Nancy dryly, stifling a chuckle. "I'm sorry about the bread and milk. I am." "Oh, I'm not. I'm glad." "Glad? Why?" "Why, I like bread and milk, and I'd like to eat with you. I don't see any trouble about being glad about that." "You don't seem to see any trouble being glad about everything," retorted Nancy, choking a little over her remembrance of Pollyanna's brave attempts to like the bare little attic room. Pollyanna laughed softly. "Well, that's the game, you know, anyway." "The game?" "Yes, the just being glad game." "Whatever in the world are you talking about?" "Why, it's a game. Father told it to me, and it's lovely," rejoined Pollyanna. "We've played it always, ever since I was a little girl. I told the Ladies' Aid, and they played it, some of them." "What is it? I ain't much on games, though." Pollyanna laughed again, but she sighed, too, and in the gathering twilight her face looked thin and wistful. "Why, we began it on some crutches that came in a missionary barrel." "Crutches?" "Yes. You see, I'd wanted a doll, and Father had written them so. But when the barrel came, the lady wrote that they hadn't any dolls come in, but the little crutches had. So she sent 'em along, as they might come in handy for some child sometime, and that's when we began it." "Well, I must say I can't see any game about that," declared Nancy almost irritably. "Oh, yes, the game was to just find something about everything to be glad about, no matter what 'twas," rejoined Pollyanna earnestly. "And we began right then, on the crutches." "Well, goodness me, I can't see anything to be glad about, getting a pair of crutches when you wanted a doll." Pollyanna clapped her hands. There is," she crowed. "But I couldn't see it either, Nancy, at first," she added with quick honesty. "Father had to tell it to me." "Well, then suppose you tell me," almost snapped Nancy. "Goodness! Why, just be glad because you don't need 'em," exulted Pollyanna triumphantly. "You see, it's just as easy when you know how." "Well, of all the queer doin's," breathed Nancy, regarding Pollyanna with almost fearful eyes. "Oh, but it isn't queer, it's lovely," maintained Pollyanna enthusiastically. "And we've played it ever since, and the harder 'tis, the more fun 'tis to get 'em out. Only sometimes it's almost too hard, like when your father goes to heaven and there isn't anybody but a lady's aid left." "Yes, or when you're put in a snippy little room way at the top of the house with nothing in it," growled Nancy. Pollyanna sighed. "That was a hard one at first," she admitted, "'specially when I was so kind of lonesome. I just didn't feel like playing the game anyway, and I had been wanting pretty things so. Then I happened to think how I hated to see my freckles in the looking glass, and I saw that lovely picture out the window, too. So then I knew I'd found the things to be glad about. You see, when you're hunting for the glad things, you sort of forget the other kind, like the doll you wanted, you know." "Hm," choked Nancy, trying to swallow the lump in her throat. "Most generally it doesn't take so long," sighed Pollyanna. "And lots of times now I just think of them without thinking, you know. I've got so used to playing it. It's a lovely game. Father and I used to like it so much," she faltered. "I suppose, though, it'll be a little harder now, as long as I haven't anybody to play it with. Maybe Aunt Polly will play it, though," she added, as an afterthought. "My stars and stockings, her!" breathed Nancy behind her teeth. Then, aloud, she said doggedly, "See here, Miss Pollyanna, I ain't saying that I'll play it very well, and I ain't saying that I know how, anyway. But I'll play it with ye after a fashion, I just will, I will." "Oh, Nancy!" exulted Pollyanna, giving her a rapturous hug. "That'll be splendid. Won't we have fun?" Maybe," conceded Nancy in open doubt. "But you mustn't count too much on me, you know. I never was no case for games. But I'm a-going to make a most awful old try on this one. You're going to have someone to play it with anyhow," she finished as they entered the kitchen together. Pollyanna ate her bread and milk with good appetite. Then, at Nancy's suggestion, she went into the sitting room where her aunt sat reading. Miss Polly looked up coldly. "Have you had your supper, Pollyanna?" "Yes, Aunt Polly." "I'm very sorry, Pollyanna, to have been obliged so soon to send you into the kitchen to eat bread and milk." "But I was real glad you did it, Aunt Polly. I like bread and milk, and Nancy, too. You mustn't feel bad about that one bit." Aunt Polly sat suddenly a little more erect in her chair. "Pollyanna, it's quite time you were in bed. You have had a hard day, and tomorrow we must plan your hours and go over your clothing to see what is necessary to get for you. Nancy will give you a candle. Be careful how you handle it. Breakfast will be at 7:30. See to it that you are down to that. Good night." Quite as a matter of course, Pollyanna came straight to her aunt's side and gave her an affectionate hug. "I've had such a beautiful time so far," she sighed happily. "I know I'm going to just love living with you, but then I knew I should before I came. Good night," she called cheerfully as she ran from the room. "Well, upon my soul!" ejaculated Miss Polly half aloud. "What a most extraordinary child!" Then she frowned. "She's glad I punished her, and I mustn't feel bad one bit, and she's going to love to live with me? Well, upon my soul!" ejaculated Miss Polly again, as she took up her book. 15 minutes later, in the attic room, a lonely little girl sobbed into the tightly clutched sheet. "I know, Father among the angels, I'm not playing the game one bit now. Not one bit. But I don't believe even you could find anything to be glad about sleeping all alone, way off up here in the dark like this. If only I was near Nancy or Aunt Polly or even a Ladies' Aider, it would be easier." Downstairs in the kitchen, Nancy, hurrying with her belated work, jabbed her dish mop into the milk pitcher and muttered jerkily, "If playing a silly fool game about being glad you've got crutches when you want dolls is got to be my way of being that rock of refuge, why, I'm a-going to play it. I am. Chapter 6. A Question of Duty. It was nearly 7 o'clock when Pollyanna awoke that first day after her arrival. Her windows faced the south and the west, so she could not see the sun yet, but she could see the hazy blue of the morning sky, and she knew that the day promised to be a fair one. The little room was cooler now, and the air blew in fresh and sweet. Outside, the birds were twittering joyously, and Pollyanna flew to the window to talk to them. She saw then that down in the garden her aunt was already out among the rose bushes. With rapid fingers, therefore, she made herself ready to join her. Down the attic stairs sped Pollyanna, leaving both doors wide open, through the hall, down the next flight, then bang through the front screen door and around to the garden she ran. Aunt Polly, with the bent old man, was leaning over a rose bush when Pollyanna, gurgling with delight, flung herself upon her. "Oh, Aunt Polly, I reckon I'm glad this morning just to be alive." "Pollyanna," remonstrated the lady, sternly, pulling herself as erect as she could, with a dragging weight of 90 pounds hanging about her neck. "Is this the usual way you say good morning?" The little girl dropped to her toes and danced lightly up and down. "No, only when I love folks, so I just can't help it. I saw you from my window, Aunt Polly, and I got to thinking how you weren't a Ladies' Aider, and you were just my really, truly aunt, and you looked so good, I just had to come down and hug you." The bent old man turned his back suddenly. Miss Polly attempted a frown, but not with her usual success. "Pollyanna, Thomas, that will do for this morning. I think you understand about those rose bushes," she said stiffly. Then she turned and walked rapidly away. "Do you always work in the garden, Mr. Man?" asked Pollyanna interestedly. The man turned. His lips were twitching, but his eyes looked blurred as if with tears. "Yes, miss, I'm old Tom the gardener," he answered, timidly, but as if impelled by an irresistible force. He reached out a shaking hand and let it rest for a moment on her bright hair. "You are so like your mother, little miss. I used to know her when she was even littler than you be. You see, I used to work in the garden then." Pollyanna caught her breath audibly. "You did? You knew my mother? Really? When she was just a little earth angel and not a heaven one? Oh, please tell me about her." And down plumped Pollyanna in the middle of the dirt path by the old man's side. A bell sounded from the house. The next moment Nancy was seen flying out the back door. "Miss Pollyanna, that bell means breakfast, mornings," she panted, pulling the little girl to her feet and hurrying her back to the house. "And other times it means other meals, but it always means that you're to run like time when you hear it, no matter where you be. If you don't, well, it'll take something smarter than we be to find anything to be glad about in that," she finished, shooing Pollyanna into the house as she would shoo an unruly chicken into a coop. Breakfast, for the first 5 minutes, was a silent meal. Then Miss Polly, her disapproving eyes following the airy wings of 2 flies darting here and there over the table, said sternly, "Nancy, where did those flies come from?" "I don't know, ma'am. There wasn't one in the kitchen." Nancy had been too excited to notice Pollyanna's up-flung windows the afternoon before. "I reckon maybe they're my flies, Aunt Polly," observed Pollyanna amicably. "There were lots of them this morning, having a beautiful time upstairs." Nancy left the room precipitately, though to do so she had to carry out the hot muffins she had just brought in. "Yours?" gasped Miss Polly. "What do you mean? Where did they come from?" "Why, Aunt Polly, they come from out of doors, of course, through the windows. I saw some of them come in." "You saw them? You mean you raised those windows without any screens?" "Why, yes, there weren't any screens there, Aunt Polly." Nancy at this moment came in again with the muffins. Her face was grave, but very red. "Nancy," directed her mistress sharply, "you may set the muffins down and go at once to Miss Pollyanna's room and shut the windows. Shut the doors also. Later, when your morning work is done, go through every room with the spatter. See that you make a thorough search." To her niece she said, "Pollyanna, I have ordered screens for those windows. I knew, of course, that it was my duty to do that, but it seems to me that you have quite forgotten your duty." "My duty?" Pollyanna's eyes were wide with wonder. "Certainly. I know it is warm, but I consider it your duty to keep your windows closed till those screens come. Flies, Pollyanna, are not only unclean and annoying, but very dangerous to health. After breakfast I will give you a little pamphlet on this matter to read." "To read? Oh, thank you, Aunt Polly. I love to read." Miss Polly drew in her breath audibly. Then she shut her lips together hard. Pollyanna, seeing her stern face, frowned a little thoughtfully. "Of course I'm sorry about the duty I forgot, Aunt Polly," she apologized timidly. "I won't raise the windows again." Her aunt made no reply. She did not speak, indeed, until the meal was over. Then she rose, went to the bookcase in the sitting-room, took out a small paper booklet, and crossed the room to her niece's side. "This is the article I spoke of, Pollyanna. I desire you to go to your room at once and read it. I will be up in half an hour to look over your things." Pollyanna, her eyes on the illustration of a fly's head, many times magnified, cried joyously, "Oh, thank you, Aunt Polly!" The next moment she skipped merrily from the room, banging the door behind her. Miss Polly frowned, hesitated, then crossed the room majestically and opened the door. But Pollyanna was already out of sight, clattering up the attic stairs. Half an hour later, when Miss Polly, her face expressing stern duty in every line, climbed those stairs and entered Pollyanna's room, she was greeted with a burst of eager enthusiasm. "Oh, Aunt Polly, I never saw anything so perfectly lovely and interesting in my life. I'm so glad you gave me that book to read. Why, I didn't suppose flies could carry such a lot of things on their feet, and—" "That will do," observed Aunt Polly with dignity. "Pollyanna, you may bring out your clothes now, and I will look them over. What are not suitable for you I shall give to the Sullivans, of course." With visible reluctance, Pollyanna laid down the pamphlet and turned toward the closet. "I'm afraid you'll think they're worse than the Ladies' Aid did, and they said they were shameful," she sighed. "But there were mostly things for boys and older folk in the last 2 or 3 barrels. And did you ever have a missionary barrel, Aunt Polly?" At her aunt's look of shocked anger, Pollyanna corrected herself at once. "Why, no, of course you didn't, Aunt Polly," she hurried on with a hot blush. "I forgot. Rich folks never have to have them. But, you see, sometimes I kind of forget that you are rich, up here in this room, you know." Miss Polly's lips parted indignantly, but no words came. Pollyanna, plainly unaware that she had said anything in the least unpleasant, was hurrying on. "Well, as I was going to say, you can't tell a thing about missionary barrels, except that you won't find in 'em what you think you're going to, even when you think you won't. It was the barrels, every time, too, that were the hardest to play the game on for Father, and—" Just in time Pollyanna remembered that she was not to talk of her father to her aunt. She dived into her closet then, hurriedly, and brought out all the poor little dresses in both her arms. "They aren't nice at all," she choked, "and they'd have been black if it hadn't been for the red carpet for the church, but they're all I've got." With the tips of her fingers, Miss Polly turned over the conglomerate garments, so obviously made for anybody but Pollyanna. Next, she bestowed frowning attention on the patched undergarments in the bureau drawers. "I've got the best ones on," confessed Pollyanna anxiously. "The Ladies' Aid bought me one set straight through, all whole. Mrs. Jones, she's the president, told 'em I should have that if they had to clatter down bare aisles themselves the rest of their days. But they won't. Mr. White don't like the noise. He's got nerves, his wife says. But he's got money, too, and they expect he'll give a lot toward the carpet, on account of the nerves, you know. I should think he'd be glad that if he did have the nerves, he'd got money, too, shouldn't you?" Miss Polly did not seem to hear. Her scrutiny of the undergarments finished, she turned to Pollyanna somewhat abruptly. "You have been to school, of course, Pollyanna?" "Oh, yes, Aunt Polly. Besides, I was taught at home some, too." Miss Polly frowned. "Very good. In the fall you will enter school here, of course. Mr. Hall, the principal, will doubtless settle in which grade you belong. Meanwhile, I suppose I ought to hear you read aloud half an hour each day." "I love to read, but if you don't want to hear me, I'd be just glad to read to myself, truly, Aunt Polly. And I wouldn't have to try to be glad, either, for I like the best to read to myself, on account of the big words, you know." "I don't doubt it," rejoined Miss Polly grimly. "Have you studied music?" "Not much. I don't like my music. I like other people's, though. I learned to play on the piano a little. Miss Gray, she plays for church. She taught me. But I'd just as soon let that go as not, Aunt Polly. I'd rather, truly." Very likely," observed Aunt Polly with slightly uplifted eyebrows. "Nevertheless, I think it is my duty to see that you are properly instructed in at least the rudiments of music. You sew, of course?" "Yes, ma'am," Pollyanna sighed. "The Ladies' Aid taught me that. But I had an awful time. Mrs. Jones didn't believe in holding your needle like the rest of 'em did on buttonholing, and Mrs. White thought backstitching ought to be taught you before hemming, or else the other way, and Mrs. Harriman didn't believe in putting you on patchwork ever at all." "Well, there will be no difficulty of that kind any longer, Pollyanna. I shall teach you sewing myself, of course. You do not know how to cook, I presume?" Pollyanna laughed suddenly. "They were just beginning to teach me that this summer, but I hadn't got far. They were more divided up on that than they were on the sewing. They were going to begin on bread, but there wasn't two of 'em that made it alike. So after arguing at all one sewing meeting, they decided to take turns at me one forenoon a week, in their own kitchens, you know. I'd only learned chocolate fudge and fig cake, though, when I had to stop." Her voice broke. "Chocolate fudge and fig cake, indeed!" scorned Miss Polly. "I think we can remedy that very soon." She paused in thought for a minute, then went on slowly. "At 9 o'clock every morning you will read aloud 1/2 hour to me. Before that you will use the time to put this room in order. Wednesday and Saturday forenoons, after 9:30, you will spend with Nancy in the kitchen, learning to cook. Other mornings you will sew with me. That will leave the afternoons for your music. I shall, of course, procure a teacher at once for you," she finished decisively as she arose from her chair. Pollyanna cried out in dismay. "Oh, but Aunt Polly, you haven't left me any time at all, just to live." "To live, child? What do you mean? As if you weren't living all the time?" "Oh, of course I'd be breathing all the time I was doing those things, Aunt Polly, but I wouldn't be living. You breathe all the time you're asleep, but you aren't living. Living, doing the things you want to do. Playing outdoors, reading, to myself, of course, climbing hills, talking to Mr. Tom in the garden, and Nancy, and finding out all about the houses and the people and everything, everywhere, all through the perfectly lovely streets I came through yesterday. That's what I call living, Aunt Polly. Just breathing isn't living." Miss Polly lifted her head irritably. "Pollyanna, you are the most extraordinary child. You will be allowed a proper amount of playtime, of course, but surely it seems to me if I am willing to do my duty in seeing that you have proper care and instruction, you ought to be willing to do yours by seeing that care and instruction are not ungratefully wasted." Pollyanna looked shocked. "Oh, Aunt Polly, as if I could ever be ungrateful to you! Why, I love you, and you aren't even a Ladies' Aider. You're an aunt." "Very well, then see that you don't act ungrateful," vouchsafed Miss Polly as she turned toward the door. She had gone halfway down the stairs when a small, unsteady voice called after her, "Please, Aunt Polly, you didn't tell me which of my things you wanted to give away." Aunt Polly emitted a tired sigh, a sigh that ascended straight to Pollyanna's ears. "Oh, I forgot to tell you, Pollyanna. Timothy will drive us into town at 1:30 this afternoon. Not one of your garments is fit for my niece to wear. Certainly I should be very far from doing my duty by you if I should let you appear out in any one of them." Pollyanna sighed now. She believed she was going to hate that word, duty. "Aunt Polly, please," she called wistfully. "Isn't there any way you can be glad about all that duty business?" "What?" Miss Polly looked up in dazed surprise. Then suddenly, with very red cheeks, she turned and swept angrily down the stairs. "Don't be impertinent, Pollyanna." In the hot little attic room, Pollyanna dropped herself onto one of the straight-backed chairs. To her, existence loomed ahead one endless round of duty. "I don't see really what there was impertinent about that," she sighed. "I was only asking her if she couldn't tell me something to be glad about in all that duty business." For several minutes Pollyanna sat in silence, her rueful eyes fixed on the forlorn heap of garments on the bed. Then slowly she rose and began to put away the dresses. "There just isn't anything to be glad about that I can see," she said aloud, "unless it's to be glad when the duty's done." Whereupon she laughed suddenly.